The report landed on Fleet Admiral Dirk Voss's desk at 600 hours on a Tuesday morning, and it was 47 pages long. He read the first line. Then he read it again. Then he set the entire thing down, picked up his coffee, realized it had gone cold at some point during the night, set the coffee back down, and spent a long moment staring at the wall while his brain quietly refused to process what his eyes had just delivered to it. The first line said, "Subject, unauthorized interaction between General Voth'Karas of the Supremacy Vanguard and an unregistered biological entity of Earth origin. Incident classification, unresolved. Outcome, unknown. Recommended action, see attached 46 pages." Dirk flipped straight to the last page, the way he always did when a report was long and he was tired and he needed to know the ending before he could bear to read the middle. He had developed this habit over 11 years of doing a job that regularly produced reports he did not want to finish. The last line read, "General Voth'Karas has submitted a formal request that the biological entity be registered as a diplomatic liaison under the Human Vanguard Partnership Framework. Request is pending review. Entity's name per General Voth'Karas, Biscuit." Dirk put his face in his hands. Biscuit, the most feared military commander in the Supremacy Vanguard, a being who had broken siege lines on 14 worlds, who had once reportedly made an entire planetary council weep just by standing up from his chair, had named a dog. He had named a dog, and he wanted the dog to be a diplomat, and somewhere in the 46 pages between the first line and the last line was apparently the full explanation of how this had happened, and Dirk was going to have to read all of it. He poured himself a fresh coffee. He sat back down. He turned to page 2. 3 weeks earlier, things had been significantly less confusing. The Supremacy Vanguard arrived in the Sol system on a Thursday, which Dirk had always privately considered a strange day for an invasion. Mondays made sense. Tuesdays had a certain grim momentum to them, but Thursday had an unfinished quality, like something that couldn't quite commit, and the whole thing felt slightly off from the moment the first ship appeared on the long-range sensors. There were 42 warships. 42 was a number the Vanguard used deliberately. Their military doctrine held that any defending force calculating resistance against a round number would unconsciously round it down in their own favor, treating 40 as psychologically equivalent to 38, treating 50 as barely more than 45. 42 introduced doubt. 42 said we counted carefully. We know exactly what we brought. We brought 2 more than we needed. Dirk, watching the readout from Orbital Defense Platform Meridian, did not feel particularly doubtful. He felt tired, which was different but not necessarily better. 11 years of this job, 3 previous species arriving in the Sol system with various degrees of hostile intent. One had turned around and left the moment they realized humanity had already been contacted by others, apparently deciding that whatever they'd planned wasn't worth the complication. One had attempted negotiations that collapsed almost immediately when their translator unit confused the phrase "we come in peace" with "we come for your pasta," which had briefly threatened to start the most calorically significant war in recorded history. The third had actually followed through on their intentions, and that particular outcome was a story Dirk did not tell at dinner parties, not because it reflected badly on humanity, but because the look on people's faces when they heard it made him feel complicated things he didn't have time to process. The Vanguard was different in the way that a surgeon is different from a thunderstorm. Both could end you. Only one had made a plan about it. They did not open with speeches. They did not broadcast grand ultimatums about inevitable outcomes and the weight of history bearing down upon lesser civilizations. They did not do the thing that Dirk had privately named the speech, which every species he dealt with seemed to believe was a required preamble to hostilities, filled with words like subjugation and cleansing, and once, memorably, galactic hygiene, which remained the most unsettling phrase anyone had ever aimed at Earth. The Vanguard arrived, took formation, and waited. Dirk sent the standard greeting. The Vanguard acknowledged receipt and said nothing else. For 6 hours, 42 warships sat in perfect formation just outside the range of Earth's orbital defense systems, and did nothing at all. Then General Voth'Karas sent a request for a surface meeting. Not orbital, not on a neutral station, not over secure channel, surface, and not at a military installation, not at any of the 17 official first contact facilities that humanity had invested considerable money and anxiety in constructing over the past 4 decades, but at a specific set of coordinates in Earth's public planetary registry. Derek looked up the coordinates. They pointed to a small town in what had once been called Ontario, in what had once been called Canada. Population just under 12,000. Primary industries, agriculture, light manufacturing, and according to the registry notes, an unusually dense concentration of heritage apple orchards. General Voth'Karas of the Supremacy Vanguard, commander of 42 warships and conqueror of 14 worlds, wanted to meet in an apple farming town in Ontario. Derek called his second in command. Commander Yara Nkosi read her the coordinates and waited. There was a long silence on the line. She said an apple town. He said an apple town. She said, do we know why? He said, the Vanguard's cultural analysts apparently determined it was the least strategically significant location on Earth's surface. They wanted to demonstrate that the fleet wasn't there to scout military infrastructure. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, that's almost thoughtful. He said, I know, it's unsettling. They both thought about the 42 warships for a moment. He said, I'll go myself. The town was called Millbrook, and it was objectively as unthreatening as the Vanguard's analysts had concluded. There was a main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office that appeared to be staffed by a single elderly man who was deeply asleep when Derek's transport landed in the adjacent field, and a number of dogs that was higher than any strategic assessment had predicted or prepared for. Derek had brought 12 personnel. He had brought translators and a medical team and a cultural liaison officer named Dr. Petra Solis, who had published 4 books on interspecies communication and had been waiting her entire career for something exactly like this. He had not brought anyone whose job description involved dogs, because dogs had not appeared anywhere in the 70 pages of pre-mission intelligence he had read on the shuttle, and he had not thought of them as a variable worth considering. The dogs of Millbrook had a different perspective. There were 7 of them in the first 5 minutes. A large golden retriever who sat in the center of the road and regarded the landing team with the calm philosophical equanimity of a being who had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. A medium-sized gray dog of uncertain heritage who investigated Dr. Solis's equipment bag with the focused intensity of a customs inspector. A small, extremely energetic brown and white creature who circled Derek's left boot 3 times, apparently conducted some kind of internal assessment, decided the boot was acceptable, and moved on. Lieutenant Harmon, who was new and had approached every element of this mission with the barely contained energy of someone who expected an explosion at any moment, said, "Are these a concern?" Dr. Solis said, "They're dogs, Lieutenant." He said, "I know they're dogs, I meant." She said, "They're dogs." The general's shuttle came down 40 minutes later. It was smaller than Derek had expected, more utilitarian than ceremonial, the kind of craft that communicated, "I am not here to impress you, I am simply arriving." 4 honor guard members stepped out first, then 2 aides, and then General Voth'Karas himself, and Derek had read every briefing on the man, had studied the photographs and the tactical histories and the psychological profiles compiled by 7 different intelligence agencies across 3 allied species, and he still was not fully prepared for the physical reality of him. He was tall, even by Vanguard standards. He had the gray-blue coloration of a senior warrior, and 4 upper limbs held with the particular stillness of someone who had long ago decided that stillness was more powerful than movement. He did not look at the assembled humans with hostility. He looked at them with something more unsettling than hostility, which was complete and utter professional assessment. And then the small brown and white dog trotted over from wherever she had been investigating and sat directly on the general's foot. The general stopped. Not flinched, not stepped back. He simply stopped in the middle of a stride and looked down at the thing that had just claimed his foot as real estate and the expression on his face was something that none of the briefings had covered. It was not threat assessment. It was not controlled response to an unexpected variable. It was something much simpler than either of those things, and much harder to name, and Derek watched it happen and understood immediately that this was going to be a very unusual afternoon. The small girl came around the corner of the hardware store approximately 6 minutes later, moving at the speed of someone who had lost track of something important. She was about 7 years old with her hair in 2 uneven pigtails, and she was calling a name that Derek did not immediately recognize as a name. She stopped when she saw the general. The general had not moved. The dog had not moved, except to shift her weight slightly to achieve a more comfortable position on the general's foot, with the ease of someone who had decided this particular spot was hers now and saw no compelling reason to reconsider. The girl looked at the general. The general looked at the girl. The 4 honor guard members stood in the configuration of people who have encountered a situation that no training document explicitly covers. The girl said, "That's my dog." The general said nothing. The girl walked forward. She walked past Derek and past Dr. Solis and past Lieutenant Harmon, who made a small involuntary movement in her direction, and then stopped himself because she was already past him. And she walked directly up to the general and looked up at him the way children look up at very tall things, which is without fear and with a great deal of open, direct assessment. She said, "She likes you. She doesn't sit on people she doesn't like." The general looked down at the dog. The dog looked up at the general. The dog's tail moved once, slow and certain, like a signature at the bottom of a document. The general said, "What is its function?" His voice was exactly as the briefings had described, low and measured, and carrying the resonance of someone accustomed to rooms going quiet when he spoke. The girl looked confused. She said, "She's my dog." He said, "Yes, but what is her function? Is she a guard animal, a working animal, a tracker?" The girl thought about this with an expression of genuine seriousness, as though the question deserved a real answer and she intended to provide one. Then she said, "She's my friend, and she finds lost socks. We don't know how she knows where they are, but she always does." The general was quiet. He said, "Socks." She said, "Lost ones. She finds them. Mom says she has a gift." Derek watched the commander of the Supremacy Vanguard process the concept of a sock-locating friend animal in real time. Then the general lowered one of his upper limbs toward the dog slowly, the way you move toward something you are uncertain about but intend to approach anyway. The dog sniffed his hand. Her tail wagged once, twice, deliberate and decisive, the way a judge delivers a verdict after careful consideration. Then she licked his fingers. The general went completely still for a long moment. He said quietly, almost to himself, "Her nose, the olfactory sensitivity." The girl said, "She can smell when I'm sad. She comes and puts her head in my lap. She's really heavy for how small she is." Another long pause. He said, "She knows when you are sad." She said, "Yeah, and happy, I think, and scared. She always knows. She's really smart. Do you want to pet her?" The formal meeting happened eventually. It happened after the girl, whose name was Emma and whose mother turned out to be the town's veterinarian, had retrieved her dog with serious apologies for the interruption and been gently redirected toward home by Lieutenant Harmon, who would later describe this as the most challenging 5 minutes of his professional career. It happened after the honor guard stood down from whatever configuration of wariness they had been maintaining throughout the dog incident. It happened in the town's community center, which smelled like old coffee and floor polish, and contained a mural of the town's founding in 1842 that featured a family who appeared to have brought an ambitious number of cows. General Voth'Karas sat across from Derek, and for the first 12 minutes talked about none of the things that were nominally the reason for the meeting. He said, "Your domestic animals, the ones with the tracking ability, they form attachments to individual humans." Dr. Solis answered before Derek could, which was the right call. She said, "Deep ones. Dogs have lived alongside humans for approximately 15,000 years. They evolved with us. Their social structures and ours became intertwined over a very long time. He said, they read emotional states without training. She said, some are trained for specific tasks, but the core emotional attunement appears to be innate. It developed across thousands of generations of close contact. In a real sense, they learned us. They became specialists in human beings. He said, we have client species, species that operate in service to the vanguard under formal treaty arrangements. They are compensated. The terms are defined. The relationships have clear parameters. He paused, then he said, none of them have located my socks. Derek did not laugh. He was genuinely proud of this. Dr. Solis said, the relationship is reciprocal in a different way. We care for them, they care for us. There is no contract, it isn't transactional. He said, and yet the animal Biscuit assessed your group immediately. She identified you as something SH. E could be comfortable with. Dr. Solis said, dogs are very good at reading a room. They pick up on behavioral cues, on the energy of being projects, on whether something is controlled or chaotic. They're faster at it than most species. Some researchers believe they're more accurate at reading human emotional states than humans are. The general looked at his own hand. The hand the dog had licked. He said she was not afraid. Dr. Solis said, no. He said, most beings respond to my proximity at this range with some measurable degree of threat response. It appears to be something physiological, not purely cultural. Certain physical indicators trigger it regardless of prior knowledge of the vanguard. Derek said, dogs don't do threat assessment the same way. They don't read size, they read behavior. They read what you're projecting at a given moment. He looked at the general. He said, what were you projecting when you walked off that shuttle? The general thought about this in the way he thought about everything, which was with complete and unhurried focus. Then he said, discipline, control, restraint, as always. Derek said, not threat. He said, I do not project threat. Threat is for those who cannot project certainty. Derek turned this over in his head for a moment. Then he said, she read certainty. And to a dog, certainty means predictable, and predictable means safe. She knew you weren't going to do anything erratic, anything frightened. You were completely in control of yourself, and she read that accurately, and so she sat on your foot. Something moved in the general's expression, the same arrested quality Derek had seen on the landing field. He said, I have spent 22 years building a professional reputation that causes hardened military commanders to hesitate before they address me directly. Derek said, yes. He said, the dog sat on my foot in 40 seconds. Derek said, dogs are direct. Dr. Solis said, they don't have any reason not to be. The actual negotiation took 4 hours, and Derek would spend considerable time afterward thinking about how differently it might have gone if Biscuit had not been there. Not because the terms would necessarily have changed, but because there is a difference between two parties arranging a transaction and two parties building something. And the difference lives not in the words of the agreement, but in the space between the words, in the quality of attention each side brings, in whether both parties feel they are being met or merely being managed. The vanguard wanted 3 things: passage rights through the outer Sol system, a communication relay station on one of the larger moons of the outer planets, and a formal trade agreement granting access to specific mineral compounds found in asteroid belt mining operations. The pre-mission intelligence had used the phrase subjugation protocol twice and territorial absorption once, and had included a section on probable orbital bombardment scenarios that Derek had read on the shuttle and not slept well after. The intelligence had been wrong in the way that intelligence is always wrong when it assumes that the worst-case interpretation is the most sophisticated one. The vanguard wanted a relay station and passage rights. Derek said, why the military approach? 42 warships for a trade negotiation. The general said, the vanguard does not negotiate from a position of demonstrated weakness. He said, you could have sent an ambassador. He said, an ambassador is heard only when the party being approached has already calculated the cost of not listening. The fleet communicates that cost clearly. He said, and yet you chose Millbrook. He said, a town with no military significance, no strategic value, no defensive infrastructure. To demonstrate that the fleet was not a threat to civilian populations, only to strategic decision-making centers. We are precise about what we threaten. Derek said, you knew we'd understand that. The choice of location was itself a message. He said, we wanted the negotiation to begin from accurate information rather than from fear. Fear produces defensive positioning. Defensive positioning produces bad agreements. Bad agreements produce the next conflict. We were not interested in creating the next conflict. He said, most species open with fear anyway. He said, most species are not good at negotiating. The terms that emerged were reasonable, more than reasonable. Humanity received preferred partner trade status in 3 Vanguard-controlled sectors. The passage rights came with conditions that protected Earth's territorial sovereignty in ways that the intelligence teams had not expected the Vanguard to agree to. The relay station revenue-sharing clause was priced fairly and included a joint engineering arrangement that both teams, once they started talking about the technical specifics, became genuinely enthusiastic about. Dr. Solis, who had spent 15 years preparing for worst-case contact scenarios, kept making small sounds under her breath throughout the afternoon that Derek gradually identified as suppressed professional excitement at everything going better than anyone had planned. It almost did not happen. Not because of any breakdown in communication. Not because of a cultural misread or a hardline position that couldn't move. Not because of anything that any of the 12 people Derek had brought to Millbrook were responsible for. It almost did not happen because Emma came back. She did not bring Biscuit this time. She brought a drawing on a piece of paper torn from a school notebook, made in crayon, depicting with the generous interpretation and confident inaccuracy of a 7-year-old's art, a tall blue figure and a small brown dog, and a great deal of yellow that was probably the sun. She handed this to the honor guard member at the door with the gravity of official correspondence. The honor guard member, who had not been trained for this either, received it with equal gravity, and then turned to face the room with the expression of someone carrying something they are uncertain how to deliver. The general was mid-sentence about communication relay specifications. He stopped. The honor guard member walked to the table and offered the drawing. The general looked at it. The community center was completely quiet. Lieutenant Harmon said Emma's name in the tone of a man who had already mentally begun drafting the unusual events section of his report. Emma said from the doorway, I made it for him because Biscuit liked him. Biscuit has very good taste. The general held the drawing in both hands. He held it the way you hold something you do not have an existing category for, not carelessly but not ceremonially either, with the careful, uncertain attention of someone encountering a genuinely new thing. He said she made this. Derek said yes. He said for me. Derek said yes. He said because her animal has good taste. Derek said that is what she said. The general looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, not as a question, not as an observation exactly, but as something he was saying in order to hear it. She is not afraid. Derek said no. He said of any of this. Derek looked at him. He said, she grew up knowing the galaxy was full of people. Her generation has never known anything else. To her, you are a very tall person whose foot her dog chose to sit on. That's the whole situation as far as she's concerned. The general set the drawing on the table in front of him. He did not set it aside. He placed it carefully, oriented toward himself, so that he could see it while they continued. He said, there is a human phrase about the unguarded perceptions of children carrying a kind of truth that calculation obscures. Dr. Solis said, out of the mouths of babes. He said, yes. He looked at the drawing again. He said, Biscuit has good taste. Then he looked at Derek and said, shall we finish? They finished. The report that had been on Derek's desk since 600 hours was 47 pages, and the last 2 were the ones he kept coming back to. Page 46 contained the formal request, written in the full official language of Vanguard diplomatic documentation, complete with classification codes and reference numbers, and the kind of dense procedural phrasing that made Dirk grateful he had people whose entire job was to parse it. The request asked that Biscuit, full name per documentation provided by Emma's mother, Biscuit Margaret Chen, 4 years old, breed unknown, but suspected to involve several different terrier lines and at least one opinionated larger ancestor, be formally registered as a diplomatic asset under the Human Vanguard Partnership, and granted the nominal designation of cultural liaison, unofficial. The reasoning, translated from formal Vanguard procedural language into something resembling plain speech, said the following. The entity designated Biscuit had demonstrated immediate and accurate assessment of Vanguard military bearing, correctly identifying it as non-threatening to civilian populations, and had communicated this assessment without translation equipment, without diplomatic training, and without cultural briefing of any kind. This represented a perceptive capability of potential value to ongoing diplomatic engagement. Furthermore, the entity's response appeared to have shaped the initial framing of the negotiations in a direction that proved mutually favorable to both parties. The Vanguard did not grant unofficial diplomatic status lightly. In this instance, the precedent was considered warranted. Dirk read this twice, then he turned to page 47. Page 47 was a personal addendum from the general, written outside official format. The Vanguard's diplomatic team had apparently attempted to remove it from the report and failed, because the general had declined to allow its removal. It read also, I would like to know what food the entity prefers, for refait. Rent's purposes. Dirk set the report down. He looked at the wall for a while. 6 months after the Millbrook Accord was signed, the Galactic Council's Diplomatic Analysis Bureau published an internal report on the negotiation. It ran to 214 pages. The executive summary on page 1 said the following. Analysis of the Millbrook engagement reveals an anomalous success rate relative to all previous human Vanguard contact attempts. Review of recorded communications and behavioral data suggests that the primary differentiating variable in this engagement was the presence of an unregistered domestic canine in the initial meeting environment. Specifically, the canine's non-tactical, non-political, unprogrammed response to General Voth'Karas appears to have established an initial relational framework outside the standard adversarial assessment model that typically governs Vanguard diplomatic engagement. In simpler terms, the dog did not know she was supposed to be afraid, and the general did not know what to do with something that was not afraid of him. This gap between expectation and reality appears to have introduced sufficient uncertainty into the general's tactical framework to allow genuine communication to occur rather than strategic positioning. The subsequent negotiation happened, essentially, in the space created by a dog sitting on an alien general's foot. Recommendation: further study of human-animal bond dynamics as a potential diplomatic resource. This recommendation is made with full awareness that it sounds undignified. It is made anyway, because the Millbrook Accord is the most favorable trade agreement humanity has produced in 11 years, and it was negotiated in an Apple town by an admiral who did not list dogs as a relevant variable in his pre-mission planning. Dirk read this sitting alone in his office at the end of a long day, and when he finished, he sat for a while thinking about Biscuit, about a dog who had not read any briefings, who had not calculated odds or assessed threat levels or consulted with anyone, who had simply trotted across a field toward the most powerful military commander in the outer systems and sat on his foot because he smelled calm, and calm was fine, and it was a warm Thursday, and her feet were tired, and there was no reason in the world not to sit on someone's foot if they were calm, and the sun was warm and they weren't going to do anything frightening. He thought about Emma, who had not been afraid because she had grown up in a world where the galaxy was full of people, and people were just people, even very large ones with 4 arms and 22 years of unbroken military record, who had looked up at the most feared general in the outer systems and told him her dog had good taste, and had meant it as the honest, simple thing it was. He thought about the crayon drawing. He had asked, eventually, what happened to it. The general's aide had informed him, with the expression of someone reporting a matter of significant personal puzzlement, that the drawing was currently displayed in the general's command quarters on his flagship, in a frame fabricated by the Vanguard's own engineering corps. A crayon drawing on notebook paper, in a military-fabricated frame, on the flagship of the Supremacy Vanguard, in the space created by a dog on a foot. The second time General Voth'Karas came to Millbrook, he came alone. No fleet, no honor guard, no documentation. A single small transport, registered with Earth's orbital authority under the name Voth, traveler purpose listed as personal visit. He landed in the same field as before, walked the same road into town, and stood on the same front porch and knocked on the same door. Emma opened it. She looked up at him, he looked down at her. He held out a package, carefully wrapped. He said, "I researched the dietary preferences of animals of Biscuit's approximate size and metabolic profile. The veterinary literature of your species was more detailed than I had expected. I also read about something called a good girl voice. I practiced it. I cannot guarantee the result is correct." Emma stared at him for a long moment. Then she grinned, the whole unstoppable grin of a child who has been given exactly the right kind of unexpected thing. The kind of thing that is generous and genuine and slightly absurd all at once. She said, "She's a girl, you said it right." He said, "I researched the distinction." She laughed, then she stepped back from the door and called into the house, loud and clear. The way you call someone you know is always glad to hear their name. She called, "Biscuit, your friend is here." From somewhere deeper in the house came the sound of small, certain paws moving fast across a floor. And then Biscuit came around the corner at full speed, assessed the situation at the door in approximately half a second with the efficient accuracy of a being who had been doing this her whole life, and sat directly on the general's foot. She looked up at him. Her tail moved once, twice, 3 times, the ruling of a judge who had already made up her mind and saw no reason to revisit it. General Voth'Karas, who had not lost a military engagement in 22 years, who had broken siege lines on 14 worlds, who had once made a planetary council weep simply by rising from his chair, slowly lowered himself to one knee on Emma's front porch and let Biscuit lick his face. Emma watched this and decided it was the best Thursday she had ever had in her life. Derek heard about it 3 days later in a brief message from Dr. Solis that said only, "He came back. Biscuit approved. I think we should update the diplomatic playbook." He wrote back, "What do we put in it?" She wrote, "Bring a dog." He thought about this for a moment. Then he wrote, "What if we don't have a dog?" She wrote back 4 words. She wrote, "Find one, it works." Derek saved the message in a folder he had labeled, in the early days of his career, with the word miscellaneous, and which now contained the strangest and most important documents he had ever received in 11 years of doing this job. He labeled the message the way you label something you expect to quote later. He labeled it, "Biscuit Doctrine Initial Proposal." Then he went and got himself a fresh coffee, and for the first time in a long time, he remembered to drink it before it went cold. The Biscuit Doctrine, as it came to be called informally among the small number of people who knew about it, was never officially added to any diplomatic training manual, partly because the people responsible for such manuals were not entirely sure how to write the relevant section, partly because there was a natural resistance among senior diplomatic staff to the idea that the most significant breakthrough in human vanguard relations had been achieved not by any of the 7 intelligence agencies, not by the 4 teams of cultural analysts, not by the 12 diplomats who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of contact, but by a 4-year-old dog of indeterminate terrier lineage who had needed somewhere to rest her feet. But the information spread anyway, the way genuinely useful information always spreads, person to person, over coffee, and in the margins of other conversations, in the way that people share things that are too strange to be policy but too true to be ignored. It spread to a junior cultural attaché named Mara Vanthorpe, who was preparing for a contact mission to a species called the Deathrin, who were known for their rigid hierarchical structures and their deep wariness of any being they perceived, as coming to them from a position of advantage. Mara read the informal summary of the Millbrook situation and spent 3 days thinking about it before she submitted a formal request to include her own dog in the mission roster. Her supervisor denied the request. Mara took her dog anyway, listed under equipment as a biological stress reduction unit, and the Deathrin delegation, who had never encountered an Earth domestic animal before, spent the first 40 minutes of the meeting entirely focused on the dog's behavior, and 0 minutes focused on establishing dominance hierarchies, which was exactly what Mara had hoped for. The resulting agreement was the first successful trade arrangement between humanity and the Deathrin in 6 years of failed negotiations. Mara sent Derek a message afterward that said simply, "You were right." He wrote back, "I wasn't right, Biscuit was right." She responded, "Same thing. He thought about this and decided she wasn't entirely wrong." The third instance was less formal and more accidental. A human scientist named Dr. Rowan Ashby was conducting a long-term research station on a world in the outer belt, studying geological formation patterns, and he had brought with him, against regulations, and with the quiet complicity of 3 colleagues who liked the animal and didn't want to be the ones to report him, a large and extremely good-natured dog named Ptolemy. Ptolemy was a mixed breed of the sort that looked like the universe had tried to make a large dog, changed its mind partway through, made him medium-sized instead, and given him a face that suggested he was in on the joke. The Velshar survey team that arrived at the research station 14 months into Dr. Ashby's posting had not been expected, had not been announced, and had not initially seemed interested in any kind of meaningful exchange. The Velshar were known for their coolness in unfamiliar situations, for their preference for assessing before engaging, for the long silences they maintained while they decided what a situation was. Dr. Ashby had read exactly none of the diplomatic briefings about the Velshar because he was a geologist, and he had not expected to need them. He had, however, offered the survey team coffee because he offered everyone coffee, and Ptolemy had sat down next to the team leader in the tight, hopeful way that Ptolemy sat down next to everyone who came to the station. Because in Ptolemy's experience, most visitors eventually provided either food or interesting smells, and the survey team leader was new and therefore promising. The survey team leader had looked at Ptolemy for a long time with an unreadable expression. Then, slowly, had lowered one hand. Ptolemy had sniffed it, determined it contained no food but smelled interesting anyway, and then put his head into the offered palm with the absolute boneless relaxation of a dog who has decided that this is now his person, at least for the duration of whatever situation this was. The Velshar team leader made a sound that Dr. Ashby's translator could not parse. The other team members, who had been standing in a configuration that Dr. Ashby would later learn indicated formal wariness, shifted into something more relaxed. They stayed for 3 days. When they left, the team leader formally requested the coordinates of the nearest human settlement that also contained dogs. Dr. Ashby, who had not expected to become a diplomatic resource, gave them the coordinates of Millbrook, Ontario, because it was the one human settlement with dogs that he could think of quickly, and because something about the way the team leader had asked the question made him think it mattered. 6 weeks after that, a Velshar delegation arrived in orbit above Earth and requested a surface meeting. Their requested location, grid reference 44.2N, 81.4W. Derek, receiving this notification, looked at the coordinates for a long moment. Then he called Dr. Solis. He said, "The Velshar want to meet in Millbrook." She said, "Of course they do." He said, "Did you know about the survey station incident?" She said, "I heard something. The geologist with the big dog." He said, "Ptolemy." She said, "We should get Ptolemy's contact information." Derek said, "We're building a diplomatic corps around dogs." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We're building a diplomatic corps around a genuine cross-species constant. Dogs are not a trick, Derek. They're not a technique. They are a real thing that is genuinely itself, and most beings in this galaxy have never encountered anything like that before. Everything in diplomatic contact is managed. Every gesture, every word choice, every decision about where to stand and when to speak. Dogs don't manage anything." They just respond to what's actually there. And that turns out to be something that a lot of species, when they encounter it for the first time, don't know what to do with except be honest back. Dirk thought about this for a long time after he put down the communicator. He thought about Biscuit on a general's foot, about a crayon drawing in a military frame, about Ptolemy putting his head in a stranger's hand in an outer belt research station, while a geologist who hadn't read the briefings offered coffee to people he hadn't been expecting. He thought about Emma's face when she'd called into the house on that second Thursday, the absolute certainty in her voice, the way she'd said your friend, not the general, not the alien, not the very tall person, your friend. As if she'd known from the beginning that this was what it was going to be. As if a dog sitting on a foot was not an accident or an anomaly, but a kind of beginning, the way a lot of important things begin, not with ceremony or planning or the carefully arranged meeting of prepared parties, but with something small and unpretentious and completely itself, trotting across a field on a Thursday morning because the sun was warm and someone smelled calm, and there was a perfectly good foot available. The Velshar meeting was scheduled for the following month. Emma's mother was notified. Biscuit's availability was confirmed. Lieutenant Harmon, who had by this point accepted that his career had taken an unusual turn, updated his operational notes to include a new category that he labeled, after a long moment of professional reckoning, Animal Liaison Protocol. He stared at those 3 words for a while. Then he added a subnote that read, ensure adequate supply of appropriate treats. Cross-reference veterinary recommendations by species size. Update as needed. He filed it. It was, he had decided, the most important document he had ever created. In the general's command quarters aboard the flagship of the Supremacy Vanguard, in a frame that the engineering corps had made to precise specifications. A crayon drawing hung on the wall beside a display of 17 military commendations and a tactical map of 14 campaign theaters. The drawing showed a tall blue figure and a small brown dog, and a lot of yellow that was probably the sun. Every new officer who entered the general's quarters for the first time noticed the drawing, and then noticed that they had noticed it, and then decided, correctly, that they were not going to ask. Except one, eventually, a very new lieutenant young enough to Till believed that asking direct questions was always the right approach, who stood in front of the drawing for a long moment and then said, "Sir, what is that?" The general said, "A diplomatic record." The lieutenant looked at the small brown shape in the drawing. He said, "Is that a dog, sir?" The general said, "The finest cultural analyst I have ever encountered in 22 years of service." The lieutenant thought about this. He said, "She must be very well trained." The general said, "She has no training at all. That is precisely the point." He looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he said, "She sat on my foot and she was not afraid, and she was completely right not to be afraid, and it had been a very long time since anything had responded to me exactly as I actually was rather than as the accumulated weight of what I represent. She had no information. She had no context. She had only her own accurate assessment of the moment, and her assessment was that it was fine, and she was correct, and I have been thinking about the quality of that accuracy ever since." The lieutenant stood very still. The general said, "When you meet a new species, Lieutenant, you will bring every tool you have. Your training and your intelligence assessments and your strategic frameworks and your cultural briefings. You will bring all of it and you will use all of it. But there will be a moment, somewhere in the meeting, when all of those tools will tell you different things, and you will have to decide which signal to trust." He looked at the drawing again. He said, "Find the signal that has no agenda. Find the thing that is simply responding to what is actually present. That signal is almost always right." He turned back to his work. The lieutenant left and thought about dogs for the rest of the day, and then for most of the following week, and then put in a quiet request to the Biological Sciences Division for information on cross-species emotional attunement in domestic Earth animals, because it seemed like something worth understanding. Back in Millbrook on a warm afternoon, Emma threw a ball across her backyard and Biscuit brought it back 17 times in a row without any sign of diminishing enthusiasm, because that was the thing about Biscuit. the thing that had been true from the beginning and would always be true. She never performed. She was never strategic. She never managed a situation or calculated an outcome or decided in advance what something was going to be. She just showed up, she assessed, she responded to what was actually there. And in a galaxy full of beings who had spent thousands of years learning to perform and manage and calculate, it turned out that this was the rarest and most disarming thing of all. Emma threw the ball again. Biscuit brought it back. The sun was warm. It was a Thursday. Everything important had started on a Thursday. The formal documentation of the Biscuit Doctrine, as it eventually came to be written, took 11 months and the involvement of 7 different departments, which was slower than anyone had hoped and faster than anyone had expected, given that the core premise of the document was that a dog had accidentally improved first contact protocol by sitting on someone. The final version ran to 62 pages, which most people agreed was about 55 pages longer than necessary, but which contained within those pages a kind of honest accounting of what had actually happened, written in the dry and careful language of official analysis, that somehow, in its very dryness, communicated the thing it was trying to communicate, that the most sophisticated diplomatic breakthrough in a decade had required no sophistication at all. The document had a section on what it called authentic presence, which was a phrase that the committee had debated for 3 full meetings before settling on, and which attempted in official language to describe the thing that Biscuit had that most trained diplomats did not, which was the complete and total absence of any gap between what she was and what she communicated. She did not have a public face. She did not manage perceptions. She did not calibrate her responses according to strategic outcome. She walked up to something new and she read it, and she responded to what was actually there. And beings across species lines and cultural divides responded to this quality with something that the document carefully described as marked increase in genuine communicative engagement, and which everyone who had witnessed it would have described more simply as, they relaxed. They relaxed because nothing about her was performing at them. And it turned out that for most beings, having something not perform at them was so unusual that it created, as the document noted in its most quoted line, an involuntary shift toward authenticity in the responding party, because the performing self has nothing to perform against when there is no audience and no expectation and only the sea. Employ direct regard of something that just wants to know if you are safe to be near. The general had been safe to be near. Biscuit had known it immediately. And something in the general, some part of him that had spent 22 years behind the weight of what he represented, had responded to being simply seen. Emma had asked on a later visit whether the general had a dog. He had said no. She had looked at him with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften things. She said, "You should get one." He said, "The Vanguard does not keep domestic animals." She said, "Why?" He thought about this. He said, "It has not been our practice." She said, "Biscuit would like a friend. She likes everyone, but she especially likes very tall people." The general said, "I will consider it." Emma said, "You should. It would make you happy." He said, "You are confident of that?" She said, "Biscuit makes everyone happy. That's just what she does." He looked at Biscuit, who was sitting on his foot again and making the small, contented sound she made when she had achieved optimal foot placement. He said, "She makes everyone happy." Emma said, "Almost everyone. She didn't like Mr. Perkins from the post office for a whole month after he yelled at the neighbor's cat, but she forgave him eventually." The general said, "She has high standards." Emma said, "The highest, so if she likes you it really means something." The general looked at the dog on his foot. He said quietly, "Yes, I have come to believe that it does." 6 months after the Velshar meeting in Millbrook, a small package arrived at Earth's diplomatic reception center addressed to General Voth'Karas in care of the Human Vanguard Liaison Office. The return address was Emma Chen, Millbrook, Ontario. The package contained a photograph of Biscuit in the backyard, printed on actual paper the way Emma's mother still did with photographs because she believed in holding things, and a note in the handwriting of a 7-year-old that said, "Biscuit says hello." She found 3 socks last Tuesday. I told her you would want to know. She is very good. She misses your foot. We hope you are doing well. From Emma and Biscuit. The diplomatic liaison officer who processed the package wrote in his handling notes, "Personal correspondence for General Voth'Karas, contents, photograph, note, no security concerns." He paused. Then he added, "Recommend expedited forward transmission." The photograph and the note arrived at the general's flagship 8 days later by priority diplomatic channel. The general's aide logged receipt, noted the sender, and delivered it personally. The general read the note. He looked at the photograph. He said she found 3 socks. His aide said, "Sir." He said last Tuesday she found 3 socks. His aide, who had learned by this point not to ask follow-up questions about Millbrook-related correspondence, said, "Very good, sir." The general set the photograph on his desk beside the diplomatic record in the frame. He looked at both of them for a moment. Then he pulled out a piece of paper, because some responses should not be sent by data transmission, and he wrote, in the precise and careful hand of someone who had spent 22 years ensuring that every word he put on paper carried exactly the weight he intended, a reply. He wrote, "Emma, thank you for the update on Biscuit's sock-finding record. 3 socks is impressive. Please tell her she is doing important work. I have been thinking about what you said about getting a dog. I have not made a decision yet, but I have been thinking about it. The drawing is still on my wall. I look at it every day. Give my regards to Biscuit's foot. She knows which one I mean. Voth'Karas." He sealed it. He handed it to his aide. He said, "Personal delivery, actual paper." His aide said, "Sir, the postage to Earth." He said, "Is not a concern." His aide said, "Understood, sir." The letter arrived in Millbrook 11 days later. Emma read it 3 times. Then she read it to Biscuit, who listened with the focused attention she brought to all things, and then licked Emma's hand, and then went to find a sock because that was the thing she did, and it was important work, and she intended to continue. And in the outer systems, aboard a flagship with a crayon drawing on the wall, a general who had not lost an engagement in 22 years sat at his desk and looked at the photograph of a small brown-and-white dog in a backyard with the sun on her back, and thought about what it meant to be simply seen by something that had no agenda and no calculation and no accumulated weight of what it represented, just its own honest and accurate self, reading the world as it actually was. He thought, "I will get a dog." He did not tell anyone. He filed it as a personal decision, unrelated to strategy, unrelated to diplomacy, simply a thing he had decided. But when the small gray dog arrived at his quarters 3 months later, transferred from an Earth diplomatic mission at his quiet request, she sat on his foot within 30 seconds. He named her Millbrook. He thought Emma would like that. He wrote to tell her so. She wrote back immediately in the same handwriting, only slightly larger because 7 had become 8 and 8 practiced writing more often. "I love that name. Biscuit says she is glad you got a dog. She knew you needed one. She always knows. From Emma and Biscuit, and now also Millbrook, I guess." The aide who processed the incoming correspondence added it to the file he had started for Millbrook-related communications, which had grown to 47 items, and was the most unusual file in the diplomatic archive of the Supremacy Vanguard, and also, he privately thought, the most important. He labeled the file the way you label something you expect to outlast most other things. He labeled it, "First contact successful." Then he went home, and on the way he passed a pet store, and he stood outside it for a moment looking at the window, and then he went inside. He came out with a dog. It seemed, at this point, like the right thing to do. Years later, when historians tried to trace the exact turning point in human-vanguard relations, they would go back to the treaties and the trade agreements and the formal diplomatic record, and they would find all the official things exactly where official things are supposed to be. They would find the signed documents and the negotiation transcripts and the carefully worded communiques, and they would note the date of the Millbrook Accord and cite it as the beginning. But the ones who talked to Dirk, who tracked him down after he retired and asked him over coffee what had really happened, would get a different answer. He would tell them, "A dog sat on a general's foot." They would write that down and look at it, and then look at him. He would say, "I mean it exactly as I said it." A dog sat on a general's foot, and she was not afraid, and he had not been simply met like that in 22 years, and it changed the quality of everything that came after. Not because of politics or strategy or the weight of history. Because one small animal walked up to the most powerful military commander in the outer systems and said, in the only language she spoke, which was the language of honest, direct response to what was actually present, "You are fine, I am going to sit here now." He would pause. He would say, and he was fine, and she sat there, and everything else grew from that. The historians would write it down. Some of them would understand it immediately. Some of them would understand it later, in the quiet of their own homes, sitting with their own dogs, feeling the particular warm weight of something that does not perform, that does not manage, that simply arrives and assesses and responds to what is actually there. All of them, eventually, would understand it. Because that is the thing about dogs. They have been teaching this lesson for 15,000 years. Most people just needed a general to learn it first, so they would believe it was worth knowing.